Hey everyone, welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. Today I'm joined by Godswill Osa. Godswill is a PhD candidate at UT Austin, whose work explores the ways people develop a sense of group identity. He holds a master's in political science from UT Dallas and is developing a theory in his dissertation that he calls partisan group consciousness. Godswill and I got to meet at the last Metamodern Spirituality Lab, which was awesome, and had a lot of amazing conversations there. And the more we were talking about these themes and topics, it just seemed like we got to do a podcast on this. And I think
Yeah.
the work you're doing is really impressive, really cool stuff. And so, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and having an opportunity to dive into some of the stuff that you're working on in your dissertation and your general academic work. So thanks so much.
No, thank you. Thank you, Brendan, for having me. I'm really excited to be on here. Got to consume some of your content and some podcasts earlier too, so I'm excited to get into the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. All right. Well, so yeah, one of the things I find so interesting about your work is the way that you're exploring this question of identity and how people construct their identity. Of course, in sort of meta-modern, regenerative, developmental spaces, in integrative spaces, there's a lot of interest in developmental ways of thinking about identity and how people, how people construct a sense of self. All these things have a huge bearing on the way people make meaning. And so, for this podcast titled Meta Modern Meaning, the kind of forefront of the cutting edge of how people are theorizing these ideas is really exciting. And I think that you're kind of doing that sort of thing. So maybe just as like a starting place, you could talk a little bit about some of the kind of intellectual heritage that you're coming out of here in terms of what you're building off of and how you're taking it in new directions. As I've read some of your work, I know that what you're calling partisan group consciousness is kind of building off some earlier ideas around just the notion of group consciousness. So feel free to kind of start us somewhere in there, but also contextualize this however you want in terms of your broader kind of research interests.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really fun. So group consciousness really it can go as far back as W.B. Du Bois, in fact, with Souls of Black Folk, with this understanding that Black people, in the sense of as they've post-Civil War, in this kind of Reconstruction period, have to make sense of how did they come together as a community to make sense of their future. And at that time, you had a kind of a intellectual struggle, and not so much a realistic struggle. These people were friends or related quite well, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And so they had different philosophies of how Black people are going to get ahead. One was a very technocratic, sort of like basically almost like a technical education sort of way of approaching Black people need to have education. We need to get that any means necessary, even that's not on par with a lot of white people and white folk. We should actually be able to use this in order to build an economic base for ourselves so we can continue to improve our community. And W. Du Bois is one of the first Black people to attend Harvard. I believe he is the first. Got a degree in sociology, educated in liberal arts, and would argue no, there's no reason why we shouldn't go for the whole thing. And in this also Black folk, he talks about the issue of Black people and how we have to conceptualize ourselves in terms of how to deal with the kind of area and time they were in, and kind of questions of can we ever really truly be integrated into this American society. Fast forward like basically almost 100 years, we have a lot of work actually building on W. Du Bois, various Black scholars, kind of thinking of looking at Black political participation. And in political science, we find in some of the seminal works by Verba and Nye about the American voter that Black individuals, despite, especially in the late 20th century, Black people have a hard time voting, obviously due to voting restriction laws, particularly in the South, right? There are a lot of economic issues in terms of the barriers to voting that we see across groups. Yeah, Black people consistently participate at higher rates than all other groups. So there was a question of why do Black people or Black voters consistently come to the polls and are engaged not only in terms of voting, but we obviously see in the civil rights movement, activism, charity, and all sorts of things that aren't considered political participation outside of other groups. And the one thing that really was able to explain this was this idea of group consciousness.
Mm.
And so group consciousness can be understood as essentially you thinking about yourself as part of a group, but not only thinking yourself as part of a group, whether that's your racial group. In this case, it's specifically racial group. I try and expand that, but in this case, specifically, think yourself not only as a Black person or a member of a racial group, but how that actually impacts you in society and whether you're willing to engage in some sort of activism, any or collective political action on behalf of your group. And so when we are able to measure this amongst Black people, in this like history of how this idea was created, we find this accounts for the differences between blacks and other groups in American society in terms of the rates at which they participate politically. And so this is sort of the legacy I come from, and there's been a lot of work kind of examining various aspects of that. There's many different dimensions of what makes somebody that creates group consciousness. This idea that your group has power versus not have power, whether that's real or perceived. We'll get into that later. Whether your status, right, like whether you want to improve your status or not, whether you're individually to blame for your lack of status as a group member, or that's part of a systemic issue, and whether you're willing to actually put something on the line to actually engage in
Mhm.
collective political action for your group. And so as time has developed, we've understood that this is not something that's just limited to Black people, although it was very useful at describing and understanding differences in Black political participation rates. Obviously, you see with the civil rights movement, we also see this present in other racial groups as well, and even white people, right? Like oftentimes in the political history, whites have been advantaged in the American government to its inception. Granted, there's levels of classification in terms of what kind of white you are, and that was always constantly expanding. There is a sense that a lot of white people do feel a sense of perceived lack of status or loss of status. And so you can also have a group conscience for groups that you may not necessarily believe or think are privileged, like are of low status. But if you perceive of low status, that's all that really matters because this is a matter of how you feel in the
Mhm.
mind. So a lot of good work was done by Ashley Jardina looking at that specifically in her book White Identity Politics. And so where I come in is argue that group identity is something very essential to human beings across the gamut, right? And it's not limited just to race, right? We find group identities from anything from online communities to our gender identity, to our sexual identity, to economic and political identities. There's is literally almost an infinite number of identities we can end up being part of. And so the beautiful thing I like that about identity is that people can choose which identities they sort of consider are the most important and are willing to sort of, organize over, right? I see people who go to anime conventions or anime cons and they like have a strong identity to this sense of being part of this group. So people will spend lots of money, they'll organize large events and have a sense of who a group kind of consciousness about that identity. So I expand that specifically to look at all sorts of identities. Then I look specifically at political identity or partisan identities, basically being Democrat or Republican, to try and explain why we see so much intensity in politics today and the kind of not only polarization ideologically, but the emotional or what we call affective polarization people feel towards the opposite party.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, that's a really helpful summary of that. And one of the things that I'm really interested in unpacking around that whole topic in a more kind of thorough way is, the various ways that this process of group formation and group identity construction can either be really healthy and developmentally sort of advantageous for people, or how it can also find various forms of pathological expression, or these issues of development are obviously really of importance in sort of metamodern spaces, and how we make meaning in terms of individuation relative to, say, group conformity is a big focus of the developmental literature. And so I want to keep that as sort of something I want to return to, but maybe you could say a little bit more in terms of, you mentioned, was it Jardina's work around white identity politics? And so
Yeah.
I am interested in the way that this notion of group consciousness relates to identity politics broadly. I know that
Yeah.
there's a critique of that term, because
Yeah,
in some
indeed.
ways people will say, well, all politics is identity politics,
Yeah.
right? But this is a really interesting way in which, we've seen recently a kind of turn in American politics in particular, where some of the aspects that were arguably emancipatory or liberatory in sort of certain kinds of group identity politics, when taken up by, say, like white supremacists or white identitarians, become actually really toxic. And so I think the question of sort of how identity formation can be done healthfully, and sort of aware of the dangerous ways that people can over-identify with their group versus taking more individualistic approaches and individuating approaches is a really important topic. So any of that
Yeah.
that you want to speak to?
That's a really good question and really good points. I mean, I teach a class on identity and identities in American politics at UT at least once a year. So I'm probably due to teach it next semester. And in it, I try and like erase people's views or ideas of what identity politics is, and I go way back to like evolutionary kind of foundations, right?
Mm,
So I start out with teaching what social identity theory is, right? Group consciousness or idea of group identity is really based in a psychological theory of social identity theory. The idea that we're not born into groups necessarily. I mean, we're born into them in terms of families and so on and so forth, but there's a moment in time where we realize we're part of something. I tell the story of when I realized I was Black for the first time, not really thinking about it, right? We're like in kindergarten, we're playing this like color game. And it's like everybody point to something that's green, we're pointing to the carpet. Like, oh, point to something that's blue, we're pointing out the window to the sky. It's like, oh, point to something that's brown, and they all go, God's will. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, I'm confused. I'm like, wait, no, oh, and then I look around, I'm like, oh, we're different. And that was the first time I realized there was actually some sort of skin color difference. And but still, even at that point, kindergarten, there's not any other of the baggage that comes with that, right? That takes time and experience. And right, there's a process by which there's a label. That was what we call the labeling part of
Mm,
it, the categorization. Right. But then it takes time to finally distinguish between, oh, my experience is different than your experience. When I find out the way what I eat at home versus what they eat at home, right? And tying that to like, oh, is this tied to this thing? And so you're adding more and more to like kind of distinguish between one identity group and the other to finally you develop this sense of identity. And this is a process that that I believe, and the research will show, is goes early back to like our kind of our competition with other hominoid like our ancestors like Neanderthals and the Denisovans.
mhm,
And so we lived among these groups, but they don't exist anymore, right? We interbred with some of them, right? But we there's no any sort of people who belong to this group, right? Because
mhm,
we won. We killed them, we outcompeted them. And our ability to do so was based on our ability to form these social group identities, right? To be able to look at our clan and our tribe, and not only do that, but hold the number of individuals who are part of that in a much larger sense than the other groups were able to. And so that's why we're able to have not just like clans and tribes that were bigger than 7, 8 people, but like 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50, 60 people. There's a number that people believe that is kind of the most you can hold in our head for in terms of close relationships, which is fair. But that's how we're able to even have the ideas of city states. We belong to city
mm.
states or to religious groups or to nations. And like now we have nation states or even like international communities of people like who are environmentalists or like who are Muslims across the world or Christians. And this is based in our psychology. And so when we talk about the difficulty in kind of avoiding the negative aspects of identification, it kind of comes down to why we came to do that in the first place. It's based on like threat, right? It's based on really base emotions like fear. And so in for us to really understand why this comes up in negative ways and how it can be positive is a combination of both holding the complexity of various identities. This is a concept called social identity complexity that Marianne Brewer wrote about, and Leona Mason incorporated a lot into her work. The idea that the more I'm able to understand, I'm also Black, but I'm also a man. I may be, let's say, a Democrat or a Republican, but I'm also a Christian. So when I go to church, I'll see people who are all parts of various identities that they're not part of, like, but I'm also part of, and understand like we're a very diverse world, and I can hold the complexity of all those identities at once. Whereas, like, somebody who's low on complexity, not only is only really able to see the world through one major identity. And sometimes they'll have maybe one or two, and they'll kind of lump them together like these are one, right? You see this with like when people talk about white Christian nationalism, right?
Mm,
People that's essentially people fusing the idea of America with the idea of Christianity with the idea of like race, right? And there's also like black nationalism, right? There's various different kinds of like sort of fused identities that are low complexity that people use to make sense of the world. And the research shows that when you're in threatened position, you're more likely to kind of come down to these more less complex identities.
mm.
So it's a combination of recognizing fear, really. Fear is probably the fear and all its derivatives or variations, anxiety, right? Anger oftentimes is the protective emotion that comes to protect us when we feel scared, right? So often people talk about a lot of anger in politics, right? But even in individual kind of relationships, oftentimes when you're maybe angry at a partner or a spouse or angry at a friend, really underlying that's like you hurt me emotionally,
Mm.
right? Or like or I'm afraid of being hurt. And so that's one aspect of it that we have to kind of understand clearly in order to understand and prevent sort of more negative aspects of identity to come on because it
Yeah.
is a sort of made up thing, right? It's constructed, right? It's something that takes time to build. It's not something that's innate to us, but it's a tool we can use. It's something that is like a like clothing we can take on and take off.
Mm.
And so when we have that understanding and recognize these sort of emotions lead to this, we can then also hold the complexity and understand that identity is very context dependent. I may be a black man, but I don't walk around the world being I'm a black man, I'm a black man, I'm a black man. There's certain contexts or situations that make rise out to my identity. But I'm taking a shower, that's not really on mine. So if that's not really on mine, is that really who I am? Or is that a better question, is that fundamentally who I am?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? And so when you're able to understand, especially when you have this increased awareness on how maybe one identity, this is what I use with my students, think of one major identity and notice throughout the day how often that comes to mind. The women oftentimes in my class talk about it's very common, right? You're in a group project, you're getting over talked, like talked over, and then you're walking late by campus, you're kind of making sure you come with your girlfriends or a friend's walking you there. So that's very constant in
Hmm.
their experience, and that's actually the most common identity students choose to write about. And so, but even then, there are moments in the day where that's not on top of mind. So, can you really say you're that? If you do, it's again, you're bringing the memory of the identity and that label into that moment to say, therefore say, I'm this. So, identity is based on memory brought into the present, and that memory is based on experience that was tied to a label. It's very much constructed. So, when we're able to hold the actual physical experience of the emotion and understand the complexity that is identity and how it really isn't an essential aspect to our who we are personally or in terms of our self-identity, then we can actually get to a place of understanding how to prevent it from becoming violent,
Yeah.
difficult, and leading to conflict of all sorts.
Yeah. Oh, this is so good. Because yeah, this is kind of the heart of what I wanted to dig into with this topic, which has so many fascinating facets to it. But yeah, I mean, like, I think when we were at the MetaModern lab, we were talking a little bit about Keegan's work, and I feel like he's really important for this because Robert Keegan's kind of developmental theory of like the subject-object relationship. There's this complexifying notion of the self, and so. What he calls kind of a third order consciousness is a kind of like one identity is really primary. Like let's say maybe someone is like I'm a loving mother to my family, right? That is who they are. That is how they identify, that they see the world through that lens. But then the move developmentally into a more complex form of identity that can hold multiple identities contextually is that it represents that shift into fourth order consciousness, which might be something like I'm a loving mother to my family, but I'm also a successful CEO of my company. I'm a really important member of my sports team, and you can actually have different sort of identities that come on contextually, and you can hold all of those together with a deep integrity. So who you are is all of those things, but it's also then none of those things individually. It's all of them, and whatever can hold all of those things is going to be a more complex and kind of a nuanced sense of self that can make those kinds of contextual moves. And what I'm interested in, because through the vector of political theory that your work is exploring, is this seems to be very much a question for us as a nation, as America is grappling with the different kinds of
Absolutely.
identity groups and how people understand their sense of self and their sort of party, affinities, these kinds of things. Is like you mentioned identity and identification with group being an adaptive strategy evolutionarily, but there are also
Exactly.
ways, right, where that can become maladaptive if we
Exactly.
do that sort of thing, and then it's actually, oh wait, this is leading to deep interpersonal and intersocial conflict. So it seems like there's a lot of pressure on us collectively to try to explore ways in which identification and the identity forming process can happen in that more complex way, really for the goal of trying to relate to each other politically in a more healthy way. So yeah, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way you put that because actually a really good way to think about this is that identities are no different than like the relationship between sugar and diabetes.
Hmm.
The adaptation we had in order to like love sugar, to seek it out, was coming from us searching for berries, the most juicy, beautiful, delicious berries, so we could literally survive. And
Hmm.
oftentimes we talk about, the men went to go hunt and women would go gather berries. You wouldn't come back and hunt all the time. So it was your survival was strongly dependent on what you could forage. And so this survival mechanism to seek out sweet things literally served us. We wouldn't be here today without that. And then fast forward, we're in the modern day. I love my favorite candy, Sour Patch Kids, specifically the watermelon kind, right? And so that same impulse that is deeply rooted within me, that has been hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, comes out with me wanting to go and buy Sour Patch Kids attach the labeling and the ads, understanding the doing the same, basically mimicking the same sort of ooh ah kind of bright colors with this candy, right? This Top Ratch kids don't have to be the colors they are, right? They're there for a reason. And so when I eat too much of that and go on my A1C's higher, I'm like, oh, this is maladaptive.
Hmm.
The genuine desire that I can't control to taste this, love you see this in kids all the time when they have candy for the first time or taste something sweet. You can't control that. But the key thing is the awareness of it. And I'll bring that back to this the awareness of how this one affects us. Awareness two of the impulse or the craving, and then awareness three of like what the goal is of why we're avoiding succumbing to this craving. And I think in the same way, we can approach this almost exactly this same sort of process with identity. That this impulse to protect our group, this impulse to defend our group and rationalize our group's behaviors, this tendency to demonize the other group is as natural as our craving to want sugar. The key thing, and it's harder in some sense, because the sugar is the activity is outside of us. It's very easily objectifiable.
Hmm.
It is extremely difficult to objectify something that feels just like you. But the same way that awareness in terms of diet and awareness of the impulse and the craving, that same sort of awareness can lead to the same sort of success with identity. The difficulty is how do you develop awareness of yourself in time? How do you develop awareness of those emotions in time, especially if it's driven by some sort of survival impulse like fear or like which is or anger, which is protective. And so this is really key and I have a study that's I'm an experiment I'm going to run, trying to explain or not explain, but examine are there ways or things we can do to kind of take a step back and feel that, be aware of what's going on within us before we make these actions. And it's in some ways sad, but other ways kind of exciting that it potentially could be that simple, right? It's a very simple thing, but the most simplest things tend to be the most difficult things. And so, an example I would use is that when I find myself maybe hating the other side or seeing somebody saying something that's ridiculous, and I'm like, oh, that's so ridiculous. Can I be aware of that experience in me? Just simply that. That allows me not to necessarily go down that ramp,
Hmm.
right? And the issue too, especially in our media environment, not even media in terms of traditional media, but social media or the way we consume information, all information, whether that's like consumerist or political, it works off those same systems.
Yeah.
So you're not only dealing with the actual impulse of your social identity that we evolved and that was adaptive, you're also dealing with people who spent decades of doing UX research,
Yeah.
psychological research to understand exactly how to actually manipulate these
Yeah.
feel-good chemicals in our brains to
Yeah.
give us more and more of that. So you're dealing with something we've never really had to deal before with society, right? We're able, due to our knowledge and understanding of these very base level foundational evolutionary mechanisms, we've hijacked them and we can do great things with them, but this is kind of the downside to it. So we have to really be able to, I think, really clearly see with increased awareness of this is going on in a way that largely people feel out of control.
Hmm.
Even myself, like I studied this stuff and I'll wake up some mornings and I'll start scrolling,
Hmm.
and it's weird because you kind of it's a mix of like I'm trapped but also I don't want to leave. It's this weird kind of Stockholm
Yeah.
syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome. Right.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
It's like I'm trapped, but I don't want to leave. So you just keep going, and then eventually you have enough, and you drop, and then you feel horrible,
Hmm.
right? And the difficulty, though, in terms of identity, oftentimes when we share something or retweet something or like something, we get the opposite. We feel good,
Hmm.
right? Because it's that same evolutionary drive. Because if you're protecting your group, you
Hmm.
should feel good. You should be rewarded for that.
Hmm.
Like that. That's what the whole warrior class evolved out of. And so there are multiple elements to this, and it's in some ways it obviously isn't as simple as just be aware, right? Like I can see that getting misconstrued and people saying that and obviously not dealing with the thing. But and it's a very complex issue, but I do keep coming back to in the same way we've able to develop awareness of how other sorts of evolutionary adaptations we have as human beings that can negatively affect us and how we can what we can do to reverse that to varying degrees of success. We can do the same internally with ourselves. And I would argue there's even a greater benefit to that because not only do you reduce the negative aspects of these mechanisms, you also get a better understanding of who you truly are,
Hmm.
right? Because if you
Hmm.
understand how these groups are created, especially if you look at it from evolutionary context, it's created by the context or the environment that you're in. And so, but all of us have various differences and personal idiosyncratic differences we have with each other, with our group. And so our ability to be more aware of who we actually are allows us to have more autonomy,
Mm.
to be more confident, to actually feel free, true freedom, to be truly sovereign, right? That comes again from this inner awareness. And I would argue that's the sort of like divine right that the founders spoke to, that like we have to seek happiness, to seek truth, and to live a life that is of meaning.
Mm.
So this goes further than simply just kind of turn on the temperature politically.
Yeah.
But it's like, how do we find meaning in this new age?
Yeah. Wow. Man. Yes. I mean, this is such important stuff. And I think anyone watching or hearing this is like, yes, this is the crux of the social crisis that we face. It's the crux, obviously, of the political crisis. And it's like, what do we do about it? And yeah, let's come back to that because that is the big question, right? But just to pry a little bit further into some of the other dynamics of this, I love your comparison to like the kind of how the food industry has sort of marketed to some of these really entrenched evolutionary aspects of ourselves, right? It's like it's not a bad thing to want sugar, like that's what kept us alive. But if you basically run that through a Madison Avenue kind of algorithm, right, and try to hijack that, and then you've got these huge epidemics, right, of obesity and all these things. So it's like it becomes maladaptive. But the key thing there is that there's a perverse incentive in the market, so to speak. Well, in that case, very explicitly to do that, right? And it seems like the obvious comparison then is that in the political market, so to speak, there are people who are basically doing the same thing. They are hijacking these aspects of the way that we behave evolutionarily for short-term political gain, essentially. And part of your thesis is around looking at how political elites engage in certain messaging efforts and how they kind of control this narrative that then ramps up a lot of this kind of group identification process to get more kind of polarized, effective, buy-in. So maybe just speak a little bit to that dynamic because there's a very clear way in which people are aware of this dynamic. It's not an accident, and they're actively sort of advancing this kind of hijacking of these impulses in us for their gain.
Man, that's a great point and a great question because again, using this, I love this Madison Avenue kind of advertising like metaphor we're using or analogy we're using. Because if you look at like a food like I don't want to say any particular companies, let's say a candy company, right? Not it's not just a candy company, right? They're
You can't
hiring
upset the sponsors of the
yeah,
podcast, brought to you
yeah.
by
TK,
Mars. Yeah. No, don't worry about that.
yeah, no, we want to get that endorsement, please.
Yeah.
When you look at a company like that, they have like typical just business like economic theory, right? They have people they have to employ, right? They have machines they have to like buy, right? Like this capital, right? They have to expand, they have to eventually create this product to sell it at a margin, and that margin is going to go back to the employees and then the investors who gave them the loans or gave them the actual investments to that company. So there's multiple interests. In some way, that's the beauty, if people go to say that of capitalism, right? Or of these kind of systems, that it's you're able to find incentives for individuals to align towards the same kind of goal, right? That's why it's so interesting how it can have its own environment and ecosystem where
Mm.
these sort of things come back and forth. The sad thing is, like we see economically, right, with inequality, we see the same thing politically. And in the same way, there are multiple incentives, right? Where you have not only the politician who we say are single-minded seekers of re-election. Like the only thing they're really trying to do, right? Even if they want to do something good, they can't do something good if they don't get re-elected. There's no point, and there's not good to be elected to one term. You want to get re-elected. So there's this balance between doing stuff that you may and feel is great for your community or not, right? Depending on who you are, and then getting re-elected. And so you want to do everything you can to be re-elected, right? And then on top of that, you have these news media companies who make money off of ads, right? Putting people up there, right? So they people want to watch things that are exciting. People want that's why WWE's like people watch WWE, people watch sports. That's why like there's so much drama around like NBA trades and NFL players, and we go into their private life. But that's entertaining. We want entertainment. News media organizations understand that. And so they're going to end up putting stuff that puts people like butts in seats, or in this case, like eyes on a screen.
Yeah.
This goes even further and is even more like micro targeted in these social media companies. And many of these traditional media companies have, you know, maybe they're called strange bedfellows because they're kind of in competition with these social media companies in that like they want that content too. And you get more eyes coming to your stuff, and we get money paid off the ads this way. And not only is it just like a CNN or a Fox News, we can figure out exactly who you are and give you the direct, beautiful, tailor-made content just for you. And
Yeah.
personally, I like that. I like that experientially. I love going on Instagram and seeing stuff that, oh, I'm like a man that likes sports, and so you're gonna give me this creator, and I'm gonna cry laughing because he sounds like my homie, right? Like I love that, right? So like also as a consumer, I want that too. I don't want to see like I don't know knitting ads, right? That my grandma or mom would get. No, right? So there's multiple incentives layered here, and so then as a result, we are sort of in this weird place where there's often this conspiracy like people control everything. It's like giant cabal, and I feel some sort of understanding of that, but in the sense that it's so complex, not one person
Yeah.
can actually be controlling all of it.
Totally. Yeah.
But we are being controlled in some sense,
Yeah.
right? And it's not necessarily more in a negative way, right? It's a sort of control where it's like by desire, right? You're giving me exactly what I want. The politician saying exactly what I want to hear to dunk on the other side, right? That makes me feel good about myself. That makes me feel good about like my group now. And this is a reinforcing cycle on the question that I'm constantly facing and wrestling with. Is like, does this stop? And I'm almost at a place where it has to almost start or initiate from a leadership perspective because
Mm.
they're the only individuals, right, within this kind of place that can actually say something that goes against this, right? Because the corporations are hamstrung by their investors. So a CEO can say, "I don't want to do this," and they're going to fire the board's going to fire him and put somebody else is going to do it. And so are the investors going to be able to do that? Try and wrangle investors whose main thing is to make money. So like it's like the whole round. So that
Yeah.
doesn't seem feasible, right? The ironically, or maybe to the founder's credit, an elected official, right, in some level, if they're able to get votes in other ways other than some coming to this sense of algorithm, right, or this sense of giving people what they want, can actually have some freedom. And we built that into the political system with the filibuster, with these kind of independent branches where you can actually take a stand and stay there and be somewhat insulated from the sort of things. But then the issue now is that this capital class has been able to infuse more and more of their control over these individuals because now it's not just about votes. You need money to
Hmm.
run. And so that becomes difficult. That becomes very, very difficult. And there's questions of money and speech, right? There's questions of like it does cost money for you to advertise to people. There's no question about that, right? It does takes resources to meet people at their doorsteps and advocate stuff. So there is a resource issue in terms of especially trying to reach people in this day and age.
Hmm.
In some sense, it's cheaper than before, but in other sense, it's even turbocharged because there's so much money in politics. So you almost have the same situation where, like, if I don't do this, somebody else is going to run, somebody else is going to take that money, and then I'm going to lose. And so even with the idea that maybe a politician is able to connect to people without creating enmity and division, they still have to deal with their reelection cycle.
Hmm.
They still have to deal with threats of people running against them. And they're based in a system where people can come together and raise ridiculous, unlimited amounts of money against them. There's been interesting case studies of particular individuals who are able to go against that. I mean, like just you're looking at maybe the presidential election. I don't remember who raised more money, but there was a sense that President Trump didn't raise as much money as Hillary Clinton had coming into the election, right? You see, even in local elections, people who have PACs with millions of dollars
Hmm.
running against people who've been in that community their whole lives. And so people are like, I know her. She was in the PTA meeting. She was on the ISD board. We go to like church together. I don't know this lady, even though I've seen her face all over TV. So there's a lot of open questions that I'm not, I don't know, I'm not stupid enough to say I have the answers to, right? But I think the way we think about this and the way we explore this can give us an understanding that the deck's kind of stacked against us in many different
Yeah.
ways. And
Yeah.
and we have many different forces influencing how we actually are relating to one another because of how we're actually identifying with what we see on these screens, and everybody's getting some benefit out of it on
Yeah.
multiple levels.
Yeah. I mean, and there's an interesting real tension here where we are in some ways our own worst enemy. Like when I'm in the grocery store and I pass by the chips, well, of course I want the chips, right? And that's playing on my deep evolutionary history of what's like, and they, oh, it's just, it looks so nice and it's been packaged so well and all that. And so I'm my own worst enemy when it comes to my, expanding waistline, right? But who, what are the regulation, what are the regulatory methods to impose some constraints, right? And when you apply that back to a political context, it actually becomes a very difficult topic, and a very sensitive one, right? Because in some ways we have the sense, which I think is largely, very justified, which is that the will of the people, the democratic sentiment. This is like what we want to follow that. We don't want to curtail that. And so, in a sense, the more democracy, the better. On the other hand, though, we're getting a version of democracy through our own, it's kind of getting coming back to us, and we're seeing what some of that looks like. And it's like, well, this can actually be inherently, it can lead to inherently undemocratic outcomes as well. I mean, a very famous instance of that was the election of Hitler, right, in Germany. Like originally, Hitler came to power through democratic means and then used that to curtail democratic efforts. And I think that there's a way in which democracy, if it, in a sense, if certain guardrails and controls and constraints aren't there, can lead to its own demise. I mean, you go all the way back to Plato; he had a sense of that,
Exactly.
and so that's a real challenge, though, because I feel like a lot of the, it's like when we see the rise of various forms of basically neo-fascism on the wing, it's hard for the people to say, well, we need less democracy. We certainly need more democracy in that sense. But it's like there's a tension there. There's a challenge of and you mentioned, the founders building some of this in. They were very keenly aware of these dynamics of sort of the mob rule element and sort of the worst angels of our nature coming in versus, and they try to set up something where there'd be a balance between these different things. But I think right now there's a very difficult way forward for us of knowing what aspects of that democratic impulse we want to, definitely basically honor, celebrate, and bring to the fore, and what are some of these other constraints that maybe we used to have built in that have now been lost or what have you. It's a very difficult political conversation to have because generally speaking, if you say to quote unquote the people, do you want more
Yeah.
influence and more say? They'll say yes, and so it's like it's a big challenge. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to make of that. I've myself politically kind of oscillated in rather extreme ways on this topic.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts about this
I mean,
kind of.
I'm right there with you. I think Plato's Republic and the discussion around like tyranny and democracy is like the fact that one of the oldest legacies of the Western like political and philosophical tradition was wrestling with the exact same questions we are wrestling with now. It kind
Mhm,
of shows it's not anything that can really ever be answered because we're constantly changing. And so it's a very difficult thing to make sense of personally. One thing I keep coming to is the idea of political leadership. Because
mhm,
the thing is that we are a republic, right? And so the purposely so, in that, I mean, obviously with all the horrors and the difficulties that the founders have, still there was sort of understanding that people had to have some level of skin in the game, right? Or that individuals at that point in time, very few were actually educated, right? Right? Very few were literate, in fact. And so there's an understanding that the nation is going to be dealing with problems, very sophisticated problems that will require people who are leaders to actually act in the best interest of the nation, but also be able to communicate that to the people. So there's a reciprocal kind of cycle where
yeah,
the nation is in some ways educated by individuals who are committed to the benefit of the country, while they may have their own partisan political spats, right? You see that with Madison, and others, or George Washington, and at some point Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. You can watch all the Broadway plays on it. They had their spats, they had their differences for sure, but there was a sense that the way in which we want the country to be, we have to get clear and eventually communicate down to the people. But even then, they had mudslinging, right? That's where all these terms come from, right? Crazy cartoons and ridiculous things said about the opponents. Like opponents are like, demons or witches and all sorts of
yeah,
nonsense. So it's even when we look at the founders' time and think of them as maybe more enlightened and able to kind of communicate and hold this, in a lot of ways, no, right? Especially when it came down to the actual art of like the capital P politics. And I think of the way I kind of come to it is there needs to be leadership. And leadership doesn't necessarily mean power in terms of like, I mean, hopefully they end up related, right? But a leader is somebody who's able to step out and show people a vision for a better tomorrow and lead them that way. And
Yeah.
to take maybe the actual interests of the people and communicate in a way that's beneficial for the people. And this may be derogatory or may not be seen as correct, but I think of like a toddler or like a baby when like the parent goes, "You have your peas," and they smack it out of their hands. They're like, "No," right? And you're like, "Hmm. If you don't eat this, you literally will die. You will not grow. You will have lower, like your brain will not be developed. All kinds of awful things are besetting this poor child if we succumb to the child's impulses.
Mm.
So, but at the same time, we also don't be like shoving this food into kids' mouth or
Right.
like slapping them until they eat it, right? Obviously, that's not okay either.
Hmm.
So what does the parent do? Oh, here comes the airplane. And then the kid's excited. And then at some point, I've seen this with my some of my little nieces and nephews. They want like, I want the peas. I
Uh-huh.
want the peas. Pea airplane, pea airplane.
Yeah.
And so at that point, the kid is craving and wanting this. And it's a process, right? Because there are times that it's not going to necessarily work. And to call the American people toddlers, I think actually some can be freeing if you include ourselves, right?
Sure.
Not like
Yeah.
we're sitting on top of them,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
like we talked about to our natures,
Yeah.
right? Like we all have those base natures. Like toddler is just has no prefrontal cortex to articulate to filter what they feel,
Yeah.
right? It hasn't developed it yet. So in a similar way, we need to do that.
Yeah.
And that's a question of like, how does that come up? How do we develop that? How do we let that happen? That's the question.
Well, I mean, there's this long standing sense in from what I'm familiar with of some of the political strategists that like you wind up being a particularly successful and transformative leader if you lead with a message of hope and aspiration, right? And you can see this on both sides. I mean, Obama was incredible for not just trying to leverage people's baser instincts, but speaking to a truly aspirational message of of not a blue America and a red America, but the United States of America, all of that soaring rhetoric. I mean, you can critique his presidency and people do, but in terms of just how he framed his political, the poetry of his campaign and what he stood for, and I personally think what he governed as well. I mean, I think that that was a very much the vision, and that is key. I mean, from the right side of things, people would say Reagan did something
Yeah.
similar. It's morning in America again, this kind of thing. But there's something about there's like this more cynical, fear-based politics, and then there's a more aspirational politics. And we seem very stuck in a kind of fear-based politics, in a kind of us versus them politics. And it seems like, yeah, it would be wonderful. It'd be ideal if a leader came to the fore who had that message of hope and aspiration. It's hard to see what the landscape is for that right now. I mean, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, some people are saying Pete Buttigieg is doing a good job trying to kind of harness some of that energy, but it doesn't necessarily seem like that is where we're going, and it's very disconcerting. But it is, I think that key polarity seems to be a really important one. So anyway, I want to throw that out there. There's another thought though. I do just want to foreground because I think it's also really important. I mean, we're laying out a bunch of polarities, right? And none of this should be I think understood either or. Like there's a way in
Yeah.
which you want democratic sentiments and kind of in a sense a kind of populism or bottom up, and there's also a way that you want leadership, top down, a kind of an appreciation for some of the institutional structures and how that work. And that's not either or, that's both and. You need both of those happening. Otherwise, you get a kind of absolutism in one direction, either tyranny or a kind of mob rule. And so all of these, again, this is the meta systematic conception of the way that the country was sort of set up, was like you need these differing interests to all kind of be in generative contrast with each other. But the one of those that I wanted to foreground is that we're talking a lot about identity and group identity, and there are certain ways obviously that can be really maladaptive and pathological, but there's also really beautiful ways that can operate, and I didn't want to leave that out of the conversation. I mean, the fact that you go home after whatever it was when you were in kindergarten or whatever, and you're
Yeah.
not just seeing that your skin's a different color, but you eat different food, and this is like this is your family, this is what you
Yeah.
identify with, and there's beautiful aspects to those differences. So one of the biggest challenges before us collectively seems to be like, how do we hold all these differences, the fact that we have these different lineages and heritages and ethnicities and cultural backgrounds that we come from, and hold that diversity without it leading to a kind of hyper group, us versus them kind of thing, right? This is the big American question, right? How do you get e pluribus e pluribus unum,
Pluribus
right?
unum, indeed.
So I just wanted to surface that because I think it's important that we also don't just go the other direction and say, oh, we've got to throw out any kind of group identity or identification. But that is the tension there, is like holding the beautiful diversity, but also not letting it devolve into a kind of division or divisiveness. I don't know if you have any thoughts about any of that.
No, that's one of my favorite topics because I think of specific presidents in terms of what I feel like some of the best presidents in U.S. history, whether that's LBJ or FDR or Lincoln, right? We have two Democrats and a Republican, but the fact that they were able to hold such complexity in the way they govern, right? And at times, each one of these individuals, you could talk about being a despotic, right? Tyrannical. FDR was doing all kinds of machinations behind the scenes
Mm,
in terms of supporting the West in World War II,
mhm,
right? Without ever consulting Congress,
mm,
right? Abraham Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, the vampire slayer. That was Abraham Lincoln doing the Civil War.
uh-huh,
At some level, he understood the darkness of where he that came upon the country and knew that this was going to be
mm,
a game of body count, just straight up. And it's we're talking this in between when we're not yet in mechanized warfare and people are still hacking at each other. It's some darkness,
mm,
quite literally. And the way he ruled too, having elections that were I wouldn't necessarily call free and
mm,
fair, right? But it was necessary in order to come to a place where then he also has a Democrat, right, as his vice president, having this
mm.
unity government,
Yep.
right, doing that for a reason. And LBJ, right? There's a story, a beautiful story of LBJ where a black aide is talking to him. It's like, how can I trust you? You voted against anti-lynching laws. You voted for segregation basically your whole career. Why should I trust you now? Like, and shout out to
Mm.
that staffer for being bold enough to talk to the president this way, right? But he's holding the real pain of his people and telling LBJ this, and LBJ that dude, I almost that MF dude. He says, "Well, I'll tell you something that maybe somebody you've heard of is has talked about me being president. I am free at last." Free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Because he, as president, had the freedom to
Mm,
actually have that ability to work in between these places.
mm,
And so I think when we look at like how identity can be both useful and also dealing with the negative aspects of it, it's it's something that comes from this awareness and understanding or something greater than yourself. So I think when identity ends up being the most harmful is when we are completely identified with it and we see it as essential to ourselves.
mm,
We know scientifically that is not true. And so the action I take my students through is like we learn about the social identity theory, and then we look at various identities in American politics, how influential and important they were to the development of our union, and the difficulties we face as a result of this, right? And we see both sides of every single sort of identity, like the good, the bad, and ugly. Nobody's immune from that in any way, shape, or form. And so the beauty I see in this, show my students as you break down your most important identity, break it down the components we learned in the class. How did it develop? What was the first memory you had? So on and so forth. And I find in their essays at the end of the course, them being like, oh my goodness, they both are able to find the beauty of their identity, but also show that's not who really they are. And you can't really actually appreciate the aspects of who you are until you get a sense of removal from it. Because when you're fully identified with it, you're not able to see the good, the bad, and ugly of it. But when you see the good and bad and ugly of it, you get to actually see what the world has always been, right? You see that
mm,
with the Serengeti and the savannah, right? Like you see the beauty and the good and the ugly of like death and destruction, but this is life. And I think another thing about politics at its best, at its highest moments, like I think of Martin Luther King specifically, you're able to hold everything together,
mm,
both the depravity and the difficulty that you're fighting against that you want to go away, but you also held the humanity of the other, right? And
mm,
we talk about kumbaya, so on and so forth, but the ability for one to actually engage in that nonviolence resistance, whether you're talking about in the United States, or you're talking about Gandhi in India, or you're talking about Mandela in South Africa, right? Or even like Tolstoy as an anarchist in America, that's you have to wrestle with oneself and really ask yourself the question, why does this word upset me? What about this is causing me anger within? Where is that coming from? It's based on identification because like that's me. That's not only me,
mm,
that's my brother, that's my sister, that's my friend. And
mhm,
it's being able to understand that is you in a real sense, right? I can't distance myself from being black, right? But when you're able to hold, but that's not ultimately who I am. I'm able to hold both the love I have for my community and my culture with the reality of the situation I'm in, and also know that that's also true for the person in front of me.
Mm,
So that person too also isn't essentially their identity, especially if they're using that to hurt me. So then
mm,
we have you're able to have a more open, more free, more aware view of the world and reality. And that's the thing ultimately that we're going to learn from this experience we have. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but we
mm,
know when you are forced to act in these identitarian ways, when you're forced to go into your spaces, the truth cannot prevail,
mm.
right? Because the most important thing is defending your identity, is defending your side at the expense of truth. We see this over and over again, both
Yeah.
in political science and obviously we all know examples of this in history. When you cannot functionally run anything or do anything based on a lie. The lie will event the truth is the truth no matter whether you like it or not.
Mm,
And that lie is eventually going to impair your ability to actually
yeah.
interact with reality.
Yeah.
And so you will fail. And you're already seeing bits of this
Yeah.
all over the world.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a failing point. There's going to be a reckoning at some
Yeah.
level. And then the
Totally.
truth will be made of aware and free to all those who see it. And the truth ultimately is quite literally in our experience, like you are not really you're not essentially the identity you think is most important. Like they always oftentimes say, I'm a mother, a mother's a mother like forever, right? You're never
Mm,
not a mother. Obviously, that's true. I feel that with my mother. I see that in her. But like when she's in the unit as a nurse, taking care of people who are going through psychotic episodes, is she thinking about being a mother in that moment?
mm,
But her caring natural nature is being put onto those people so that they can heal. And so when we have flexibility and remove the rigid structures around what we take ourselves to be and how we move through the world, then we're able to actually appreciate the beauty of our identities and get to the actual essence of what makes them beautiful and appreciate
mm,
that. So that's why I say with like white people too, like a lot of white people's cultures were erased for the hope of trying to be included within the American system,
mm,
right? It's like there is white culture, right? But the sad thing is that it's oftentimes it's oftentimes seen as a what it's not that or it's not
mm.
this. Like I've heard about Midwestern spaghetti. That's something unique only to Ohio, right?
Mm,
Like only white people in Ohio are going to be able to create something like that, and people love that. I look at the Midwestern nice of Iowa, of Nebraska, right? That's legitimate. There's no way around it. It's tied to their Lutheran roots and then the Scandinavian ancestors. Or you see with the Scots Irish, there's real
yeah.
actual difference and pain and beauty. Like folk music comes from the mountains of Appalachia. There's no way to unwind that. But the sad thing is that when we bind to these essential ideas of who we are, we remove the beauty that
Mm,
actually exists within our tradition. And then when you're cut off from that, all you have is what's in front of you, right? What people are trying to advertise to you and tell you what to do. So you lose your sense of sovereignty and freedom too.
mm. God's will for president is what I'm saying. I know you've been in operating in the political sphere. It's like you should run for office. I think what you say is just so. I mean, it is that aspirational vision as I see it, right? Which is that yes, we come from these deep stories, traditions, lineages, identities, and there's beautiful aspects to that, core important aspects to that. And they are part of us, but if we only see through those and we don't see the complexity of how we move through the world in these different ways, then we are going to be missing so much about the ways that one, we can have a harmony of all that different plurality of where people are coming from, and two, just at an individual sense of knowing who we are, we're missing out on something much deeper, all right, if we're just seeing our own self through, yeah, like I am a soccer player, or I am a Democrat, or I am a Republican, whatever. It's like we are much more than that. And if we don't allow ourselves to see that, then yeah, we're limiting our own kind of more expansive understanding of ourselves, and we're also limiting how we can live together amongst this beautiful plurality. And I think you just do an incredible job articulating that, and gosh, it's beautiful. I mean, so yeah, I completely agree. I mean, so I guess unfortunately starting to move a little bit towards a close and bringing some of these strands together to wrap this
Yeah.
up. Um, where are we with this? Like collectively, individually, what you started talking a little bit about where we go, how do, based on that way of seeing things, what do we do in this moment of hyperpolarization and a kind of narrowing of group identities into a very strong us versus them, yeah, kind of dynamic. Are there individual practices people can do? Are there ways we should be thinking about reforming the system that could be more conducive to people entering this kind of way of seeing themselves? What are your thoughts of sort of, yeah, like how we move forward with this?
I think of it like when people have cancer, for example, there's usually like multiple treatments, right? You're gonna go through chemotherapy, you're probably gonna have some surgery, you're probably gonna engage in some other therapies, immunotherapies. Whereas you have this cocktail of therapies and things that are going to be used to solve one issue. Because when we look at cancer, cancer is not just as simple as like a tumor growing. There's so many things going on genetically in terms of the cell, its proliferation, the things going wrong within the cell. And that's why we struggle curing cancer because every single instance of cancer is its own kind of mini problem, even though we use this broad word. And I think the same thing exists with this, except I don't think, unlike that's why the social scientists, sometimes we get like physics envy or like the idea is that like we sometimes say physicists have the easy job or
Hmm.
scientists have an easy job. Eventually, when you figure the thing out, you can run an experiment, you can show it, and then that's it. You build a medication for it. I got to work in labs growing up in college too, so it's beautiful. Yeah, we created a device that solved this thing. Yay. Socially, we know that's not really always possible. We
Yeah.
created institutions like we have, right? The fact that they've endured this test of time, that they've included, America gives me chills because despite all the difficulties we face, we are the first and longest lasting multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy in
Hmm.
the history of mankind. This has never happened before.
Hmm.
It's never happened before. It's an experiment. And so, in order for us to go forward, we have to consider all these levels and layers, both from the individual down to the national. And so, maybe starting off from the national, there's a guy, I forget his name. I don't want to misquote him, but he worked. I worked in a think tank with him, and he was a political scientist. Now he's a like former journalist, former political scientist, and he writes about structurally, institutionally, how can we set up the election system so that it's not biased towards these kind of polar
Hmm.
opposites,
Hmm.
right? This has always been an issue and question
Yeah.
from the founding. George Washington, when he resigned, gave this very moving speech, being like, basically telling is basically, I'll call them like their political children, please don't do this. Please don't factionalize,
Yeah.
right? Like, especially George Washington being in those trenches, crossing the Delaware, toes probably gone. Like he was with them boys in the trenches.
Hmm.
He crossed river with them, so he understands. Like, yo, I sacrifice a lot, and a lot of people sacrifice a lot. Please don't do this. This is only going to lead to bad things, and we still weren't able to do it because it's something that we can't undo. And so the question is, how do we set up institutional systems so that votes don't get converted to this, like added to this kind of fuel? And
Hmm.
there's a lot of different ideas, right? Louisiana has something called a jungle primary, where like everybody has to run together in a primary, and then there's like a runoff for the general election. But Louisiana hasn't necessarily solved the issue either,
Hmm.
right? So I don't know if necessarily that's the solution. You can talk about particularly maybe ranked choice voting,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
kind of that's kind of complicated for people to get, right? Like math, I had to do a paper on math paper on that,
Hmm.
like the arrows and possibility theorem, and like how to set up ranked choice voting and what like how can you really actually get to preferences,
Hmm.
and you can, but it's for the regular person who often just goes and votes. That can be very confusing, especially older individuals
Hmm.
who are consumed used to a certain way of voting. So that can be very difficult and there's a lot of issues in terms of just clarity of that. We've seen that with the New York mayoral election. There are also different ways in which setting up like the actual system. So how Congress is actually voted and elected, right? This like winner take all sort of system. We
Yeah.
can maybe, but this is a constitutional amendment, so this is even harder, right?
Yeah.
Kind of shift that to proportional, so
Hmm.
that every single election you don't feel like your team automatically loses.
Right.
It's just proportion based on the vote, and so it keeps things in check. But still, that doesn't necessarily stop this kind of partisan nature from it evolving. And so there's a lot of different potential solutions and questions, and it'll probably be a combination of things that will need to happen institutionally. But then the question or the thing that comes to mind is like, are we really, is there even the political impetus for that
Yeah.
to even
Right.
happen? Right. So then there's a question that goes down from okay, institutional level to the politician level. I think there needs to be a project of some sort that is going to be able to help articulate the best version, the most good faith version of either side to one another, right? Or
Hmm.
to the voters in a sense,
Hmm.
to help lower the temperature. And this is going to take leaders who truly see and feel and understand whether I like I like this person or not. right? Whether I agree with their ideas or not, we both are committed to the nation, and we see the factionalism and the partisan rancor that's going to destroy this nation, and decide like we're going to try and create put people in office and vote for people and use language that brings it down, right? And people, I think that'll be refreshing, honestly.
Yeah.
But honestly, at the end of the day, I find myself, especially somebody who studies this and looks at this all the time, and a lot of people who like scroll and then feel shitty afterwards. It's like, what can I do? And
Hmm.
honestly, this is probably where I'm the most interested. I think there's the most kind of work available because the political system is really a reflection of the people, as long as we're voting. And to this point, actually, I make this point to a lot of people. Think of all the money that's being spent in politics. Oftentimes it's seen as corrupt. It's like these billionaires, but they're not just this happens, right? They're not just changing money and like, rubbing hands. That's money spent on ads to convince you and me how to think.
Mm.
The vast majority of the billions being spent in politics is to trying to convince you how to vote.
Mm.
So you actually, as an individual, like has like quite a bit of autonomy and freedom in deciding whether you're going to allow what happens in this world to affect you or not, right? And but so this goes down to personal development, like individual development. What I see in my students when they take my class, can you develop awareness within yourself for who you really are? This is the point of living. This is what we all hope to do,
Mm.
to really truly understand ourselves and live authentically in the world. When if people do that, it creates system order change. The difficulty is that it doesn't feel like it's anything. I'm just one person. And like Down's voter theorem, all the time they say it's actually illogical to vote. Your vote has no meaning. If you look at the grand scheme of things, we gotta flip that. And we understand this with complexity science, like Santa Fe Institute does. We look at this in like network science, right? We see this in like systems, a complex systems theory, adaptive systems change, that individual movements that ants do on a mound have higher order
Yeah.
effects.
Yeah.
And so if you're a kid and you like mess with one ant, you could see the whole line mess up. And then that whole line messes up. They're not able to get food back. They just wasted like so. There's orders and orders and orders and orders of effects that our actions have that we will never see. I like to think of it this way, right? And this is a sentimental story, but my mother was an orphan. Her father died before she was born, and her mother died at childbirth. Her
Mm.
mother, the last action she did before she died, she called her brother over and like it said like you need to take my daughter to your village. She cannot stay another night here. You are her father, and if you don't, I will haunt you if you don't. You are her father,
Wow.
and you will raise her like any of your children. And my mom's father, right, her uncle, but like biological uncle, but her father was like, oh yeah, but you're gonna be okay. Don't worry, don't worry. Like it's gonna be fine. He said like he like took my mother was walking to back to his village, and before he made it halfway, people are calling your sister is dead. Your sister is passed.
Wow.
That action, my grandmother had no she couldn't even conceive what that action did. Because of that, my mother was able to get educated as a woman in 1960s, 70s Nigeria. It was also going through a civil war. That allowed her to leave and actually go and seek greener pastures in America. That allowed her to meet my father and to have me. So I'm not talking to you here if that doesn't happen. And could she even imagine we'd be talking on Zoom
Mm.
across from each other? It's impossible.
Mm.
It's impossible, but we can literally feel the actual impact that had.
Mm.
This conversation has been invigorating, right? None of this is possible
Mm.
unless that happens. Our actions have that effect every single day. But we're convinced that they don't because we don't see it. And so if we're actually able to improve who we are, increase our inner awareness, which also leads to increased happiness, increased meaning, right? Better relationships. The benefits are
Yeah.
limited, right? It's like exercise, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? People going back to the sugar example, right?
Yeah.
We find that if you do cardiovascular exercise, 30 minutes every day, apparently that's better than all the medications, all the things you could do. And it's that simple. I
Mm.
think in a similar way, just inner awareness, just questioning, not for any other reason, but for your own happiness, to actually live what the founders wanted our country to actually be a place for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How are you engaged in that pursuit? Is scrolling TikTok, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to demonize anything, right? But it's like, and then getting mad about stuff and then posting about that and then not being aware of how this affects your inner sense of happiness, not being aware of the emotions this is stirring up within you that actively makes you worse off. Just the
Mm.
awareness of it will allow you to make a decision whether you want to do this or not. And
Hmm.
even myself, I find myself then not consuming as much brain slop and actually going to the creators I actually enjoy. So this has effects on your relationships, which has effects on their relationships, which has effects on like your community, both here and then now into like internationally, abroad. Now that we're connected this way, this has real effects.
Yeah.
You have to trust, and we have research to show just because we don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And I honestly think this would be the most effective thing.
Hmm.
This would be the most effective way
Wow.
because ultimately institutions are reflections of our ability to regulate them,
Yeah.
our ability to see something's wrong and change them. All this is change. If we're not able to actually see that within ourselves as a community, as a polis, then there's no hope on those levels.
Hmm.
And there's going to be new and new technologies that are going to both make this more likely and
Hmm.
maybe make things more dangerous.
Yeah.
So there's always something coming up that we haven't seen that only our ability to respond will allow us to be able to actually use in order to improve ourselves, our communities, and ultimately our republic and democracy. So I really believe that at the end of the day, what you and me and people watching this are able to do after they listen to this podcast, is literally the most important thing you can do.
Hmm.
Because it actually has the effects that you can't see, but we know actually happen.
Yeah. Wow. Oh man. Yeah, beautifully said. I mean it's again it's aspirational and inspirational. It is ultimately, a call back to um our own selves, our own, journeys of trying to expand our consciousness and our care and concern and our awareness, right? And so if we can do that individually, you get enough individuals, you have emergent consequences on the system you're involved in, and you can change your country, you can change the world, if there's that kind of shift. And yeah, there are these phase transitions too, that are talked about in complexity science, where you get this kind of tipping point, and there is a sense in which, the question, I guess, before us is what does that look like for us to be able to do that collectively, where enough of an expansion of our sense of identity, and then the expansion of our mutual care for one another and other kinds of identity. Where does that create a tipping point where we're living in a radically different kind of society on the other side of that? I mean,
Exactly.
it's troubling because obviously right now a lot of the trends are in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah,
It's like we're moving further away from anything like ranked choice to more gerrymandering to, all this kind of stuff. So it's clearly, it's very easy to be dispirited by it, but what you're saying, I think, is just so true and so profound, and important. So anyway, thank you for that. I think that's a beautiful place to kind of land this, but I would love to have more conversations with you about this. You're such an
likewise.
eloquent speaker on this topic, and it's so important and it's so urgent. So I think the work that you're doing is, awesome. Can't wait to see what emerges from that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the best of luck on your PhD, your dissertation, and looking forward to exploring more of that as that gets developed. But God's will, Osa, thank you so much, my friend. This was a delightful conversation.
Brendan, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. You are a great podcast host, and I would love to dive in further into a lot of the work and ideas you have regarding metamodernism and how that relates to a metamodern politics. I know Hansi
Mm,
Freinacht and their work, seminal work, really gets into that, so we can jump into that maybe next time. But again, this was probably one of the best conversations I've had recorded ever. So I'm
awesome, man.
excited to talk more in the future. This was great.
I appreciate that. And I should also say, is there anything that you'd like to say to add into if people want to find your work or anything you're putting out there? Is there anything you want to share for people so that they can engage more with your stuff or?
Yeah, I'm in the process of building a website. Godswillosaid.com is gonna have stuff about my work. I'm also a trained yoga teacher. So I really like to bridge both the high with the low, or making sure that we're both connected on both levels and regulating that. Other than that, nothing else.
Okay.
Probably more to come from me, and then we'll have more to plug next time. But again,
Awesome.
I'm really grateful for this conversation.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much, my friend. Till next time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.